Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a seriously provocative piece of writing. It's an essay by financial writers Bill Bonner and Joel BOWMAN called The Middle Class Delenda Est, which literally translates to The Middle Class Must Be Destroyed. Sounds intense, right? Well, we're going to impartially unpack their main and, pretty controversial argument that today's economic policies aren't just accidentally squeezing the middle class. Nope, they argue it's part of a systemic, historical cycle designed to wipe them out. Whether you end up agreeing with their conclusions or not, looking at our current economic data through the lens of ancient history is, well, it's just a totally fascinating way to look at things.
Okay, let's dive right into this. We'll be hitting 5 key areas today. First, the modern economic squeeze, then the Roman Empire blueprint, the brutal math of unaffordable housing, the inflation wealth transfer, and finally a cultural clash between elites and the common man.
So, Part 1, the modern economic squeeze, focusing on some very real data on debt and layoffs. To really grasp the immediate financial pain everyday people are feeling right now, Bonner and BOWMAN point us straight to this absolutely staggering number, $16.5 trillion. According to a Federal Reserve report they cite, that is a fresh, all-time record for collective household debt here in the U.S. Get this, in just one single 3-month period, that debt skyrocketed by $351 billion. But the authors say the massive red flag here isn't just the total number. It's that credit card balances saw their biggest jump in over 20 years. Basically, everyday people are having to borrow heavily just to keep their heads above water and maintain their normal baseline standard of living.
And this brilliantly illustrates the other half of that squeeze. The authors take that soaring consumer debt and put it right next to rapidly vanishing job prospects, specifically calling out those massive tech layoffs we've all been seeing. Look at these figures. Twitter slashing its workforce by 50%, Robinhood at 31%, Snap at 20%, Meta cutting 11,000 jobs. Bonner and BOWMAN make the point that when debt goes way up and job security goes way down, the middle class gets pushed right to the absolute brink. Think about it in your own life or industry. When that safety net just vanishes and the credit cards are already maxed out, the squeeze is incredibly real.
Moving on to Part 2, the Roman Empire blueprint. Are we just watching history repeat itself?
Now, the whole core of their essay rests on this idea that this modern financial squeeze, it's not actually new at all. It's a historical playbook. To prove it, they take us way back to ancient Rome. They point out that the massive success of the Roman Republic was originally built entirely on the backs of middle-class citizen farmers. We're talking about fiercely independent, self-sufficient people who were deeply loyal to their homeland. But, and here's the kicker, Bonner and BOWMAN argue that exact independence made them a huge threat to the ruling elite. Why? Because you can't easily buy off a self-sufficient middle class with free bread, or distract them with circuses. So the authors map out this distinct, brutal historical cycle that systematically wiped out the Roman middle class. It goes like this. Step 1. As the empire expanded, these citizen farmers got shipped off to fight in permanent, endless wars, sometimes hundreds of miles away for up to 20 years at a time. Step 2. While they were gone fighting, their farms back home fell deeply into debt, just so their families could survive. Step 3. The soldiers come home, they absolutely cannot pay off those debts, so they're forced to sell their land to elite landowners. These elites then consolidated all those family farms into massive, slave-run plantations called latifundio. You can kind of think of it like the ancient Roman version of a ruthless corporate private equity buyout. And finally, step 4. Completely unable to compete with plantation pricing, that once proud middle class had to abandon their land and in a lot of cases literally sell themselves into slavery. And the authors draw a direct, straight line from the destruction of that middle class right to this date. 476 AD, the fall of the Roman Empire. Their conclusion is pretty stark. They say once that loyal middle class was gone, Rome had to rely on pay-to-fight mercenaries. Well, eventually the empire's money dried up, those mercenaries stopped fighting, and a lot of times they turned right around and attacked Rome itself. Without a strong middle class to keep order or actually care about fighting for the homeland, the completely unprotected empire just fell to invading barbarians.
Let's move to Part 3 and see how this builds into the modern day. The math of unaffordable housing, looking at the suburbs versus the projects.
The authors transition directly from those ancient Roman farms straight into today's American real estate market to show us exactly how the middle class is losing its foothold right now. On one side, you've got the classic middle class ideal, independent row houses, suburban homes with nice backyards. It's a place where a family has their own space, which they describe as clean, safe, and basically just what everyday people actually wanted. But on the other side, they show us what they call the high-rise horrors, designed by elite urban planners. Bonner and Bowman argue that these top-down planners essentially decided that poor and working-class folks should live in these massive big-box warrens and tenements. They claim this kind of elite urban planning really eroded the safety and prosperity of those traditional middle-class neighborhoods.
But honestly, according to the text, the real weapon destroying middle-class homeownership right now is just the raw, brutal math of interest rates. They bring in financial analyst Vitaly Kitsenisen to break this down, and the numbers are wild. Let's say you bought a $420,000 house in 2019 at a 3% interest rate. Your mortgage was basically around $15,000 a year. But today, with rates jumping up around 7.6%, that exact same house, literally no changes, now costs $30,000 a year in payments. Double. If you look at a median household making roughly $75,000 a year, housing is now eating up half of their entire income. The authors argue that Federal Reserve policies have fundamentally taken housing, which is the absolute main vehicle for building a family's wealth, and made it totally unaffordable.
Which brings us to part 4, the inflation wealth transfer, and how our time gets devalued.
So, if housing affordability is the first big mechanism wiping out the middle class today, the authors assert that inflation is the second one. And their logic makes a lot of sense. The common man makes his living by selling his time. But as they point out, wages have trailed inflation for 19 straight months. When inflation hits, it's literally devaluing that time you just spent. You're working the exact same hours, putting in the same sweat, but your money buys significantly less at the grocery store or the gas pump. Meanwhile, they contend that the elites are using inflation as this super painless way to fund massive government borrowing and spending, like the trillions of dollars printed during the COVID era, and they get to do it without ever having to directly raise your taxes.
And here's the really crazy part. The proposed cure for this inflation, it often hurts the middle class just as much as the disease itself. They throw in this quote from St. Louis Fed President James Bullard, who stated that interest rates might need to rise as high as 7% just to fight inflation. So, framing it the way the authors do, the central bank prints a ton of money, that causes inflation, which completely drains middle-class purchasing power, and then to fix it, they raise interest rates, which entirely prices that same middle class out of ever buying a home. It is a vicious, vicious cycle.
And finally, part 5, elites versus the common man. We're looking at a serious cultural clash here. In this last section, the authors pivot away from the raw economic data and move into a pretty heavy sociological and political critique. They draw this incredibly sharp line between two distinct groups. In their view, the common man operates on good old-fashioned common sense, right? He saves his money, he values hard work, he looks both ways before crossing the street, and he's naturally a bit skeptical of sweeping changes. He knows you just can't get something for nothing. But on the flip side, they describe the elite class as pushing what they call uncommon nonsense. According to the essay, these elites are busy chasing the latest investment fads, relying on fake fiat dollars that got introduced back in 1971, and basically believing they have the ultimate right to write all the rules from the top down, totally ignoring the practical, everyday wisdom of regular people. Now, what's really fascinating about this is how the authors anchor their warning about our future. They point straight at the elite organizers at the Davos World Economic Forum, and they quote one of their promotional videos, which famously stated, "You will own nothing and you will be happy." Bonner and Bowman argue this is absolutely not just some catchy PR slogan. They think it's a literal step-by-step roadmap. From pushing for super dense, high-rise urban planning, all the way to proposing outright bans on single-family homes in the name of energy efficiency, the authors assert that global elites are actively, deliberately trying to engineer a future where an independent, property-owning middle class simply does not exist anymore.
Which really leaves us with this massive, overarching question based on the text today. If history truly does repeat itself, what is the ultimate fate of the modern middle class? The authors of The Middle Class Delenda Est have laid out a pretty intense case. They're arguing that our soaring debt, impossible housing markets, and relentless inflation are basically just the modern-day versions of those permanent wars and latifundio plantations of ancient Rome. They see it all as a structural, systemic squeeze deliberately designed to transfer wealth and power upward. So take a look at the economic data all around you today, compare it to those historical precedents from the past, and ask yourself, are we just going through a temporary economic rough patch, or are we literally watching the systemic dismantling of the middle class?